Who's the real toughest actor in Hollywood history? I'm not talking about movie muscles or fight scenes. I mean the stars who survived real battles, brutal careers, and behind-the-scenes chaos. And when we hit number 4, you're gonna pause and say, wait, what? Stick around because the names on this list will blow your mind. And the stories behind them? Even crazier. He didn't just play tough, he was tough. The kind of man who could stare down a battlefield or a camera lens with the same unflinching intensity. These are the stories Hollywood didn't script. These are the real legends. Men whose off-screen grit made their on-screen personas feel frighteningly authentic. Today, we're peeling back the curtain to reveal the truth behind the 10 toughest actors in film history. And if you think their toughness stopped when the director yelled "cut," think again. One name in particular was so fearsome that studio execs were terrified his real past would ruin the illusion. They thought no one would believe it, but they underestimated how much truth can be more staggering than fiction. Let's kick this journey off with a man who was more dangerous in real life than any villain or hero he played. Audie Murphy. Standing at just 5 feet 5 inches, with the kind of face casting agents usually pegged for choir boys or sweethearts, Murphy didn't look like the quintessential action star. But that's the twist. Because behind those youthful features was the soul of a warrior. Long before Hollywood ever rolled the cameras on him, Murphy had already lived through battles most couldn't even imagine. By the time he was 19, he had held off an entire company of German soldiers alone, wounded, and nearly out of ammo. That wasn't a movie scene. It actually happened. And for it, he earned the Medal of Honor. Murphy didn't stop there. His war record reads like a tale stitched from a dozen war epics. He took out tanks, stormed machine gun nests solo, and kept fighting after being shot 3 different times. By the time he left the battlefield and entered the studio lot, he'd amassed 28 medals. That wasn't fantasy. That was Audie's life. Hollywood took notice when Life magazine put him on the cover. But when he showed up for his first screen test, security wouldn't let him in. He looked too harmless. But inside that young man was someone who had personally ended more enemies than many military units combined. His kill count was estimated between 240 to 300. Just imagine. More than most armies would claim, carried by a single man who never asked to be feared. What really sends chills? He played himself in To Hell and Back. Yes, the war film was about his story. And even then, the producers had to tone it down because the truth seemed too outlandish for audiences. The director later admitted they left out details because, simply put, no one would believe them. Audie carried that battlefield with him long after the war ended. At night, the past wouldn't let him sleep, and he'd keep a gun under his pillow. His wife once said he had 2 sides, the gentleman in public and the haunted soldier in private. But Murphy never let that darkness consume him, except for one chilling moment, when a businessman threatened him during an argument, and a switch flipped. One witness said, "I looked in his eyes and knew this man could end me without blinking." That wasn't an act, that was instinct. And maybe the most fascinating detail? Audie never wanted to be the guy with the gun. He longed for roles in comedies, romances, something soft, something far from war. But directors couldn't unsee what he truly was. The rarest kind of performer, one who didn't just fake it for the camera. He'd lived it and somehow survived it. Then there's Charles Bronson, a man who didn't just come from hardship, he was hardship. Born Charles Bukinski, the 11th of 15 kids in a coal miner's home, Bronson didn't grow up playing with toy guns. By age 10, he was already hauling coal out of the ground to help his family survive. Poverty wasn't a storyline, it was his reality, and it left its mark. His stone face, squinted stare, and clenched jaw weren't crafted in makeup chairs. That expression came from growing up where weakness wasn't just mocked, it was dangerous. Bronson fought in World War II as a B-29 gunner, flying missions over Japan. He was wounded and decorated, and when he came home, stardom didn't greet him at the door. He worked as a cook, a boxer, an onion picker, over 50 jobs before acting stuck. His screen presence wasn't about swagger, it was about someone who knew pain and how to mask it with silence. His punches on screen? They didn't feel choreographed. They felt like he was dragging real violence into the scene. During The Mechanic, co-star Jan-Michael Vincent recalled that Bronson only had to grab him for a scene, but the strength in his hands was terrifying. It wasn't acting, he said. It was real. And when mafia threats emerged after Death Wish, Bronson didn't blink. No bodyguards, no panic, just a dry reply. "I've lived through worse." That kind of cool isn't taught, it's survived. Director Michael Winner put it best. Charles doesn't pretend to be tough, he just is. There's a rawness in that, a truth that doesn't need performance. And it set Bronson apart from every other screen tough guy who had to imagine struggle. And then, Lee Marvin, the man who walked like he'd seen hell and come back angrier. Marvin fought in the Pacific during World War II as a Marine, and took a machine gun wound that nearly crippled him. It severed his sciatic nerve and left him limping for life. He just hid it from the cameras. But pain? He knew it, and he never sugar-coated war. He once said, "I was a Marine sniper, got shot, got sent home. Anyone who says they enjoyed combat is either lying or a fool." That brutal honesty fed into every role he took. Marvin didn't act like he'd been in violent situations. He had. Directors like John Borman said when Marvin played a killer, you believed it, because it wasn't drama to him. It was memory. Every fight he performed carried the weight of what he'd really seen. Every silence carried the ghosts of what he'd lived. When actors like James Coburn said they were nervous around Marvin, you knew it wasn't just admiration. It was fear dressed as respect. And we're just getting started. The deeper we dig, the more truth rises to the surface. And what we uncover next might change how you see some of Hollywood's most legendary faces, forever. He wasn't just the king of cool. Steve McQueen was a real-life rebel who lived like his movies were only half the thrill. Long before his name lit up marquees, McQueen's reality was far from glamorous. Raised in chaos and bruised by abandonment, he left home at just 14. The streets didn't scare him, they sharpened him. Then came the Marines. Discipline didn't come easy. He was thrown in the brig for skipping out on leave. But even that couldn't define him. The same young man who clashed with authority later dragged 5 fellow Marines from a tank submerged in icy water. That wasn't a movie scene. It was Steve McQueen, unfiltered. His Hollywood journey didn't sand down those edges. After odd jobs that read like a vagabond's resume, lumberjack, oil rigger, carnival barker, he stumbled onto acting. But instead of ditching the danger for cameras and comfort, McQueen doubled down. He didn't just act like he was living on the edge. He actually was. This wasn't a man hiding behind stunt doubles. He performed his own risky moves, often refusing safety measures and sometimes even logic. That might sound reckless, but to McQueen, risk was oxygen. His obsession with speed and machines became legend. McQueen didn't just pose on motorcycles, he raced them. Under aliases, he entered competitions so his film studios wouldn't find out and shut him down. He didn't want safety, he wanted velocity. In The Great Escape, every motorcycle chase, except that iconic fence jump, was him, flying down dirt roads with no camera tricks to hide behind. Why? Because he believed danger made the story real. And speaking of real, few remember that McQueen raced with the pros and beat many of them. At the grueling 12 Hours of Sebring in 1970, he placed second, not with pampered hands or a fully healthy body, but with a cast on his foot from a recent crash. That cast was just another challenge to overcome. For McQueen, limitations were invitations to defy gravity. His longtime stunt double, Bud Ekins, didn't mince words. Steve wasn't pretending to be tough, he just was. Imagine being so fearless that even seasoned racers respected you. Not for fame, but for skill. That was McQueen. He didn't want to look tough, he wanted to be it. And he was. But McQueen's devotion to danger didn't stop on racetracks. During filming for The Sand Pebbles, he threw himself into a raging river and nearly drowned. He didn't panic. He fought the current like a man born to battle nature. On the set of The Towering Inferno, where the flames were real and the risks terrifying, he charged through scenes with fire licking at his heels. For most, this would be madness. For Steve, it was Monday. Director John Sturges once said the real challenge with McQueen wasn't getting him to do dangerous stunts, it was stopping him from doing the truly lethal ones. He wasn't addicted to fame, he was addicted to the edge. You can't fake that kind of fearlessness. You either have it, or you don't. Steve McQueen had it in spades. And when things got dark, like in 1969, when he learned he was on Charles Manson's infamous hit list, he didn't cower behind bodyguards. No, he armed himself with a Magnum and vowed to handle things his way. No entourage, no fuss. Just one man, one weapon, and a commitment to survival. Racing legend Mario Andretti said it best. Hollywood was full of tough guy actors. Steve was the real thing. McQueen didn't just take risks. He made risk his co-star. Then came Kirk Douglas, a force of nature carved from hardship. Long before red carpets and leading roles, he was selling snacks to factory workers for pennies. The son of immigrants with barely enough to eat. But hunger didn't make him bitter. It made him stronger. When most would fold, Douglas wrestled his way to a scholarship. Quite literally. This wasn't some Hollywood wrestling gimmick. These were real bouts, earned with grit and pain. During World War II, Douglas served on a submarine chaser. Tight quarters, constant threat. The type of assignment that breaks spirits. But Douglas endured, even after sustaining injuries that got him medically discharged. Where others would see a setback, Douglas saw a new beginning. And when he entered Hollywood, he didn't leave that fight behind. On Spartacus, he trained like a gladiator. Not for the cameras, but because authenticity mattered. When advised against a fall during filming, he did it anyway. The injury should have sidelined him. He returned 2 days later. Why? Because for Douglas, pain wasn't a problem. It was proof he was doing something right. Stanley Kubrick once admitted that clashing with Douglas was inevitable. When he decides something, it happens. That was Kirk. His toughness wasn't just muscle, it was will. And after a helicopter crash in his 70s nearly ended him, Douglas clawed his way back to life. Then came the stroke. Again, he fought. Not for the spotlight, but for dignity. He learned to speak again, wrote a book, inspired millions. And who could forget James Cagney? At 5 feet 5 inches, he looked anything but menacing, until he moved. Raised in the rough corners of Manhattan's Lower East Side, Cagney learned to fight before he could spell it. Boxing wasn't a sport, it was a lifeline. His compact frame became a weapon, fast, sharp, relentless. His screen fights weren't choreographed ballets, they were echoes of survival. Director Raoul Walsh once said Cagney threw punches like a real fighter, because he was one. Add in his background as a dancer, and you had a man who could float like a feather and hit like a hammer. Grace and grit in one package. Co-stars learned that the hard way. He didn't always pull his punches. You could feel the realness. Bob Hope put it best. Mess with Jimmy and he'd drop you, then help you up and fix your tie. That was Cagney. No swagger, just skill. In his own words, I preferred standing. And that's exactly what he did. From McQueen's daredevil spirit to Douglas's indestructible will, and Cagney's no-nonsense fists. These weren't characters. These were men who didn't just survive Hollywood. They redefined toughness from the inside out. And the deeper we go, the more we wonder, who else behind those iconic roles carried a story far bolder than the scripts they read? Charlton Heston's journey through Hollywood was more than just a march of triumphs. It was a battle of grit, discipline, and sheer willpower. This wasn't a man who faked valor, he lived it. Long before his iconic turn in Ben-Hur electrified the screen, Heston was dodging real bullets in World War II as an aerial gunner, staring down death from the cramped belly of a B-25 bomber. He didn't boast about it. He simply carried the weight of that experience in every performance. You could see it in his eyes, the kind of hardened calm only war survivors possess. And when Hollywood called on him to perform under punishing conditions, he never flinched. For the 10 Commandments, Heston worked through scorching desert heat in Egypt, often refusing body doubles, despite crew members collapsing from exhaustion. The heat was merciless, the terrain unforgiving, but Charlton thrived where others wilted. One crew member later recalled that while others shielded themselves between takes, Heston would walk alone through the sand, rehearsing his lines with the same intensity he once gave his military drills. What made him truly captivating, though, was his refusal to compromise physical performance for comfort. In Ben-Hur, the chariot race remains one of the most breathtaking sequences in film history, and Heston insisted on doing it himself. He trained with professional stuntmen for weeks and drove the four-horse chariot with fearless precision, enduring real injuries that could have easily ended the shoot. But instead of backing down, he pressed forward. As the cameras rolled, the audience wasn't watching a performance. They were witnessing commitment in its purest form. Behind the scenes, Heston's life was equally driven by discipline. But not all of it was under control. Those closest to him observed that the same resolve that made him unstoppable on camera also made him stubborn in his personal life. As he aged, Heston's strong opinions and deep sense of responsibility toward society pulled him into political storms that sometimes overshadowed his artistry. Still, no matter how controversial his views, one truth remained constant. Charlton Heston embodied resilience. And yet, as he faced the slow decline of health in later years, Heston responded with the same steeliness. The man who once braved desert heat and lived gunfire met aging not with complaint, but dignity. When he stepped back from public life, it was not out of fear, but out of respect for the legacy he had built and the audience who revered him. Now, pulling the curtain back on the financial life of this silver-screen gladiator reveals a saga as grand as his filmography. Heston's portfolio gleamed with luxury and precision. Over the decades, he drove a range of classic and exotic cars, from the 1960s Lincoln Continental to a Ferrari 365 GTB/4 Daytona, reflecting a blend of American prestige and European flair. On his wrist, he was often spotted with a gold Rolex Day-Date, a symbol of timeless confidence. His properties were reflections of his towering persona, chief among them, a sprawling Beverly Hills estate with sweeping canyon views and private screening rooms. Heston also invested in a sleek Gulfstream III, allowing him to travel the world in comfort that matched his reputation. Business-wise, he wasn't just a performer, he was a planner. Heston held stakes in film production companies, authored multiple books that added to his estate's long-term value, and collaborated with fellow legends on licensing deals that extended his influence well beyond Hollywood. He held extensive insurance policies, not only protecting his home and assets, but also covering his career, especially during periods where physical roles carried significant risk. His health insurance later supported advanced treatments and care, reflecting a lifetime of strategic foresight. What can we learn from this towering figure? Heston's story reminds us that real wealth isn't just about earnings. It's about building a legacy through discipline, strategic choices, and fearless self-investment. He lived not for indulgence, but for impact. He made his money work through classic assets, thoughtful insurance, and ventures that secured both financial strength and cultural relevance. His journey urges us to invest in endurance, not just opulence. As the spotlight fades on this era of true Hollywood warriors, what lingers is the weight of their stories, etched not in pixels but in passion. Mitchum's haunted gaze, Quinn's bruised fists, Wayne's iron resolve, and Heston's thundering voice all remind us. These weren't just actors. They were architects of an age where toughness wasn't a trope. It was true. And in a world increasingly curated, sanitized, and safe, their imperfections, raw strength, and pain-born wisdom feel more valuable than ever. You can't replicate that in a studio. You can't fake it with filters. These were lives lived hard, roles earned with real scars. So as we look back, one question lingers. Who in today's Hollywood can carry that mantle without dropping it? Because for Wayne, Mitchum, Quinn, and Heston, toughness wasn't a role. It was a reality, and it shaped every frame they left behind. All right, that wraps up our countdown of the 10 toughest actors in Hollywood history. From iron-willed legends to those surprising warriors behind the scenes. Who shocked you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments, I'm curious. If you enjoyed diving into these stories, Hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a deep dive into Hollywood's wildest tales. Up next, we're unpacking some of the biggest on-set feuds that rocked Tinseltown. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Remember, these stars didn't just act tough on screen, they lived it. Toughness isn't just about muscles or guns, it's about heart, grit, and legacy. And that's true Hollywood gold.